My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one can take them out of my hand. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one can take them out of the Father's hand. The Father and I are one. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus.
One of my favorite pastimes when I'm trying to relax is to watch reruns of old westerns on TV. So I watch Bonanza and Gunsmoke and The Virginian and the myriad of other westerns that have been produced over the decades. And I find it total escapism. It relaxes me. Don't ask me why, but it does. But I also learned something from that. I learned all about range wars from those westerns. I had no idea what a range war was. I thought range wars were between the cattle ranchers. But that's not exactly what range wars were all about. Range wars were often fought between cattle ranchers and the dirt farmers who were settling the West, and especially those who were sheep farmers, because the sheep farmers presented the greatest threat to the cattle ranchers. See, when the West was first settled, everything was open range. There was no fences, nothing to stop the cattle from grazing on all of those wonderful grasslands. Not until a few different things occurred. One being the invention of barbed wire, which presented a huge problem. And believe it or not, Troy has a connection to barbed wire because John Roebling, who went to RPI, was one of the greatest barbed wire manufacturers in the world prior to him building the Brooklyn Bridge. But that's a whole nother homily. I won't get into that. But see, when they would put the barbed wire up, they, all of a sudden, when the dirt farmers were taking possession of particular lands, they didn't want the cattle overrunning their crops. So they would fence off their areas that were their own fields. In the same way, then, the sheep farmers heard about all of the wonderful grazing lands. Well, sheep have this way of just mowing down entire acres of land when it comes to grass and grazing. So that presented a huge threat to the cattle ranchers. And so what breaks out are these great range wars between the cattle ranchers and the sheep farmers. Now, you cannot imagine that a gentle sheep could possibly elicit such anger, such violence, but it did, to the point where the cavalry had to come in to protect the sheep farmers from the cattle ranchers. But we've been dealing with that for 2,000 years. That a shepherd and some sheep flocking together can cause a huge uprising amongst people. We see that time and time again. We see as the sheep continue to prosper, to continue to be fed, to be nourished, they continue to multiply. And in their multiplication, it becomes threatening to others. And so we hear in that first reading from the Acts of the Apostles how Paul and Barnabas go to Antioch. And in going to Antioch, they also engage the Jewish community. But at the same time, Paul and Barnabas are also reaching out to the Gentile community. And they are gathering that Gentile community together. They're flocking together in ways that never were seen before. Because Paul and Barnabas were not requiring them to first become Jews before becoming baptized Christians. And so with that then, that creates great animosity in Antioch. And because of that animosity that was created, Paul and Barnabas are driven out of Antioch. And Paul and Barnabas do exactly what Jesus tells us in the scriptures to do. They just shake the dust from their feet, and they themselves, as members of the flock, and also called to be shepherds, go on to the next town, to the next village, to gather the flock together, to lead them on, and to lead them forward. And because of their willingness to do this, we hear in the second reading from the book of Revelations that it becomes a multitude gathered together. In John, in speaking of his own revelation, he speaks about how this multitude is gathered together by the Lamb of sacrifice, of course, who is Jesus Christ. And it is the Lamb who is also the shepherd of the flock. And the shepherd of the flock will guide and lead the flock to safety. And the shepherd of the flock will feed, nourish, and quench the thirst of the flock itself. That the flock will have no need or want of anything, because the flock will share in the glory of the resurrection itself. And that the shepherd himself will even wipe away the tear of any member of the flock. But that shepherd and that flock have elicited a response over the millennium that cannot always totally be understood, because the shepherd is gentle, is kind, is merciful and peaceful. And the flock itself is also called to respond in that very same way. To have confidence in the shepherd, to follow the voice of the shepherd, for the shepherd will lead us into safety, into the glory of the resurrection itself. And ultimately, the shepherd will overcome all pain, all suffering, all persecution, even death itself. By the way, did I tell you how those range wars ended?
Yeah.
The sheep are still grazing in those fields.